Efron, and I'm just going to ask Janet if she will just briefly introduce herself, give a little bit of background, and explain what she does here at HT2 Labs. Over to
Thanks, Craig. Yeah, so my name is Janet, and I work with HT2 as their data scientist, and I've been with the company, I guess, Craig, you and I both, for about 2 years now. And I actually started out many years ago with a degree in geophysics, and later on did graduate work in information science. And my interest has always been in how do you use information well? How do you get the right information? How do you analyze and interpret it to get meaningful answers to questions? And I've always also been extremely interested in how people learn. So kind of that transition into doing data analysis around learning with both that awareness of the principles of learning and the principles of design, along with that love of analyzing data, kind of brought me into the role I am now.
Thank you, Janet. And I think it's very useful, the pair of us hosting this webinar. There's you at what I consider to be the peak around data collection, data analysis, and learning analytics. And then there's me at the other end of the spectrum, kind of muddling his way through, making mistakes, making some very broad assumptions, and often getting things wrong. So I'm hoping that between the pair of us, yes, we've got your insight and experience and knowledge, but we've also got my very novice and somewhat wide-eyed approach to data as well. I think between the two of us, hopefully we can give people what they're looking for this afternoon. So let's start doing that right now. Let me move on to the first screen. The first thing that I committed to talking about and covering was why you might want to start collecting data. What's the purpose of it? I want to get some of these answers from you guys before I let myself and Janet loose on providing some answers. And once again, I'm just going to change the screen layout ever so slightly. And we can see that there's a question now in the left-hand side of the screen. Why might you want to use data? Now, that question is a very broad, it's a very wide-ranging question. Drop your answers into that chat panel, if you will, and you can be as specific as you want. You can be as broad and as general as you want. Just think about why you might want to use data. Think about it from the perspective of what you're doing right now. Whatever project or piece of work you're involved in, try and use that as an example. But also think long term. Think about the things you'd like to start doing. Start thinking about the things that you think you really should be doing if it's not what you're doing right now. And think about why you might want to use data to substantiate and back that up. So I'm going to mute my microphone for a few moments, and I'm going to let Thomas, Tom, Francois, and I can see that we've been joined by Alistair there. Good afternoon, Alistair. If you could hear me, if you could let me know in the chat panel if you can hear me okay, and I'll just quickly reiterate what we're doing whilst the other three guys are clicking away. You can hear me, brilliant. So the question that I'm asking everyone here, Alistair, is why might you want to use data? We're right at the beginning of the session. We've just done introductions and a brief introduction from Janet, so you haven't missed the meat of it as yet. Why might you want to use data in your role? And the brief that I gave you, the three guys, was you can be as broad as you want. You can be as specific as you want. You can be as focused in the here and now, or you can be more future focused, the things that you might like to be doing or would prefer to be doing. Wherever you feel you fit on that spectrum, why might you want to use data? I'm going to mute my microphone unless anybody else turns up in the next few minutes. And Janet, if you see anything dropping into that chat panel that you want to sort of seize upon, please feel free to do so.
Yeah, well, there are actually a lot of things that are making me really happy here because, sometimes working with learning professionals with data, it's kind of a new horizon, and it's very easy to be just very task focused on the data. And everything here is falling into that realm of looking at our data analysis in an ecosystem. So like the comments about providing data that just not only gives students sense of progress, but gives teachers insights into their teaching, that's hugely important. Looking at learning paths, looking at accountability.
I
Yeah,
think
showing
it's
Alistair says to show L&D is of value to the organization. I mean, that's the thing at every conference I go to, that it's the discussion about we want a seat at the table and how do we demonstrate value, which is, I think, really hard in L&D because a lot of times the things that we're teaching, the results are not simple results in and of themselves, but the impacts occur at a process level or at a systemic level. And so we have to find ways to show impact even when it's not perhaps as directly measurable as if you know, do some fine tunings on equipment on a production line.
I think it's fair to say, Janet, isn't it? We've ran this webinar two or three times, I think, previously, and if memory serves me right, this is probably the higher end, I guess, of the answers that we've received. Sometimes they're very mixed. Sometimes they've been very transactional, compliance scores, bums on seats, if you like. But what I'm scanning through here and picking out is that everybody seems to have that much higher level, more strategic, more business focus than pretty much most of the previous ones we've done in this session. Am I right in recalling that?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. You know, and these are the kinds of questions that are nice because they help you build a nice data project, because you can start saying, you know, what are the goals behind your data project? And how do those tie into the common, you know, overarching goals for L&D? And how do they tie into the overarching strategic goals for the organization? And then that allows you to start tuning your project of saying, what data is going to tell us if those goals have been met? What are the metrics and measures we can use? How do we know that we've succeeded in the context of L&D or in the context of the organizational goals? And the kinds of questions that people are bringing up here are dealing with that issue, that learning problems are business problems, are organizational problems. And I think that's how we demonstrate our value. Yeah, for better designing and minimalist interventions, I really like that, as I'm seeing coming up in the comments. My co-author of the book, Sean Putman, and I would talk a lot about designing to get the data we need, but then using the data to improve our design. Because as we dig into the data, you can really see what aspects of the course work and which ones don't. And then you can ask why and make those fine-tunings and improvements.
For those of you that are busy still typing away, I would direct you back as well to the normal chat panel. That's the panel in the bottom right-hand corner-ish of your screen. That's going to remain constant throughout this afternoon's session. So if you've got any questions for us, I'm mindful that we've been asking you the questions so far, or we've asked you one. If you've got questions for us, please do drop them into that chat panel. That's exactly what it's there for. Or if you've got your microphone enabled, feel free to open your microphone up. I'm going to change screens ever so slightly, but don't worry, we are coming back to this layout in a few moments' time, and you can add anything to that column that spares your memory. But for now, I'm just going to change the screen out ever so slightly. I'm going to take us back to that Y screen that you can see there now, and I want to progress your thinking a little more now. What I want you to think about is whereabouts data already exists in your organization that you may not have considered. So what I'm doing is I'm giving you a little bit of time and space now to think about, yes, the obvious pieces of data, the things that you probably or possibly work with day in, day out. They're your go-to data sources. But they won't be the only ones. I guarantee they won't be the only ones in your business. So I want you to now think and start to share some ideas about where else the data might be in your organization. Maybe it's somewhere that you do go to regularly, but you think the other people on this call might benefit from having that insight into some places that you go for data that they may not. So once again, I'm going to change the screen layout. I'm going to bring in this column now, slightly different, well, similar column, different question. Where is the data in your organization? Once again, you can start, Francois, quick off the mark there. You can start dropping your answers into there. Where's the data in your organization? And if you're already going somewhere that's, let's say, unusual, that people may not have thought about, please do let us know.
I think Craig may have had to silence himself because I think that there was a little construction work going on outside his office window, so I think that's made things just a little difficult on his end. And the one thing that, let's see, Moodle platforms. And the other thing I would say about data is there are two kinds of data we want to think about when we're thinking about where the data is. Yeah, they're the sources of learning data, the ones within the LMS, the ones outside, things that might be resource access, conferences, resource or blog creation, using beacons, things like that. But we also want to look at sources. What are the sources of performance data in the organization? Because I think that's the other side of the picture if we're wanting to demonstrate impact and look at the kinds of improvements that everybody was bringing up to the first question of where are your sources of performance data in your school or organization.
Thank you for padding there, Janet. Yeah, you're quite right. I've got a guy laying some flooring in. He was a little bit late, so there's a little bit of noise going on in the background. What I'm going to do is I'm going to mute my microphone again, but I'm going to carry on dropping in. And I must admit, these are pre-prepared examples. Look at the blue that I'm dropping in here. Here's some additional examples for you to think of.
Yeah, Tom, you bring up a really good point as you're talking about with your analytics data. The why is missing, and the quantitative data is often what we are most able to get our hands on, and it's also the quickest and easiest to analyze. But it is that qualitative data that we have to kind of hunt down to put the meat on the bones. And I found that in a number of projects that the numbers only brought me to better questions that I could then go and maybe look more qualitatively. I'm looking for instance client questions and requests for support. Yeah, anytime that we're getting, help center reduced calls or reduced errors, or seeing where the questions and what kinds of questions are coming in, that starts giving us both quantitative and qualitative data. Are we supporting well? Are we providing information well?
So I'm conscious.
I'm sorry.
I was just about to say, Janet, I'm conscious that the question I ask people is, where is the data in your org? And a lot of the examples that I've posted in blue, they're not really where, they're KPIs, if you like, they're business measures, they're success measures. I'm not saying where they are in your organization because I don't know where they are in your organization. Instead, I'm hopefully planting a seed for you to think, I'd never thought about that KPI, or I'd never considered that as being something that we might be able to impact upon, but actually we possibly can. So I'm not saying where it is, I'm perhaps saying what it is, and clearly you can go away and find out where it exists in your business.
Alistair, I wanted to follow up because you're saying we'd be interested to see if clinical systems here track user data. So I'm not exactly sure what you work in, but it sounds like you are in healthcare. That's my guess. I'd be interested to hear more of some things that you're maybe thinking about.
Yeah, Alistair's probably going to take the answer, but he works in the National Health Service in the NHS here in the UK. So I'm hoping that some of these, what I'd like you to do now, guys, is just have a look back through this current column that we're working on and just let us know any that you've seen or read that you'd not thought about, any that have perhaps caused a little light bulb to go on above your head, any perhaps that have made you think, now that's interesting. Just let us know if there's anything that's dropped into this column that's made you sit up and look at it slightly differently. I'd be interested to see what sparks have been caused, what may have become a catalyst for more. As always, guys, if you've got general broad questions for Janet or I, you've got the chat panel in the bottom right-hand corner, and some of you have also got microphones enabled as well. So Thomas is responding, saying analysis of social media. Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it, Thomas? it's prevalent, it's everywhere. We know that it can make or break almost overnight some businesses. So it could be an interesting metric to try and track and see what the change might be.
Yeah, Alistair, that's a really interesting one to say. Yeah, how do you see if patient data is being recorded accurately? That's a really, I would imagine, an incredibly significant performance metric and a somewhat complex one, but really a critical one to get right.
Guys, I'm going to change this screen layout again. I know some of you are still typing away, but we will be coming back to this screen again. Instead, I want to give you a little bit of a breather. We've worked you quite hard so far. We've hit you with two quite complex questions from the off. Take a little breather now, and we're going to put Janet under the spotlight now. And I want to ask Janet this question. I want you to talk to us, Janet, if you would, about what we need to know about our data. Talk to us about what we need to know other than just the raw information that's being displayed on the screen. Guys, you can take a breather now. As always, if you've got questions as Janet's talking, please do drop them into that chat panel. Janet, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Craig. Yeah, so the first thing is that this is a group that's, I think, clearly already doing some work with data and much more conscious of it than some L&D professionals who are just really starting to take their first steps into that. So if this gets to be too basic, just throw it in the chat panel, and Craig will yell at me and redirect me. But for me, when I'm working with data, the single most important thing is to know what it is that makes that data come into being. Each piece of data, what is it that causes that to exist? For example, if I'm working with some course data and I get a statement, an XAPI statement, a piece of data that says that somebody has viewed a piece of content, what does that mean? Does that mean that they spent a certain number of seconds on it? Does it mean, what exactly is defining viewed? What does it mean to say somebody's completed something? What are the parameters around that? And that would be both the design parameters maybe in the course and also the systems parameters. And so this often involves looking not just at your design of your course or your design of your outside of the LMS sources of data, but it often involves talking to the developers and kind of getting behind things and saying, actually, what does this mean? And this can be important. For example, a situation I had with an LMS where the LMS would record that somebody had completed an activity only once. And for an LMS, that makes sense. Okay, they've completed it. But often a user might go back and use that activity several times, which means over on the XAPI side of things where I was getting my data, I might have 3 or 4 completes on the same object for an individual user. And those are going to be 2 different sets of data, and I'm doing analysis. I have to be mindful of how these things get created. In performance, it can be important if how are sales accounted for, how are other things accounted for, knowing within each group how they account for things so that you can do meaningful interpretation. And that kind of brings us to the next thing that's really important, which is understanding your data supply chain. Understanding your activity providers, it's understanding your systems architecture, it's understanding any data management principles that are in place. And then it involves getting into your key activities, looking at what are the key activities for each platform or for each data source. And sometimes what helps is to consider some common use place scenarios for each data source to say, how would users typically use this? What are the things from that? What are the data points that might be useful for the assessment I want to do? And then there's the reality of how hard is it going to be to get the data I need? Because we have data owners that we often have to negotiate with, especially if we're working outside the LMS. So it's knowing who are those key personnel, and it's knowing who the customers for your data are and saying what data is going to be useful to them in their decision process. And sometimes those data customers may be in a position to help liaise and get data from data owners who might be somewhat reticent to give you access. And we need to look at, as we go through this thing, who are the players, who are the people who need to participate in this process. And it's always that constant, I think, tension of getting buy-in, but it's so worth it if we can get our data supply chain pulled together and get that information lined up. If you don't work with data a lot, it's good to just know a few basics about managing quantitative data. Just knowing to do a basic sense check of your data. Do the number of data points make sense? Looking at some descriptive statistics, is the range of data from the high point to the low point, is that a reasonable range? Is the number of data points reasonable? Does the center of the data make sense? Do you have outliers you need to discount? And if you start applying some basic statistical methods, you don't have to be a statistician, but you owe it to yourself and to your data customers to know the caveats around any data tool you use. It's real easy these days to throw a linear regression at anything, but not everything's suited for a linear regression. And the last thing, and I know I'm going on quite long on this, but the last thing to know is what's good enough. You want to know, when have I gotten my data sufficiently tuned, my analysis sufficiently tuned to meet the business need. At least for me, it's very easy to keep going for perfection, and a lot of times that's taking time away from other things. And I guess that's a project management thing for any kind of project, but I find that with data, you almost have to make sure you've got that mapped out in your metrics ahead of time, so you know here's my logical stop point. And Craig, I'll take a breath now because I've been going on quite a while, and I could go on for another hour on this.
Thank you, Jen. No, I think it's worthwhile, to hammer that point home. Yes, there's looking at the data that's just in front of you, the numbers, the colours, the data itself, but understanding where it's come from before it gets to you and how it's been created. I've certainly found a real eye-opener over the past year or two that I've been working with Janet. So I would completely stand by what you've just said in the last few minutes. Okay, it's time to throw things at me now. So get out your rotten vegetables, use nappies, diapers, whatever you want to call them, because it's now time to throw some stuff at Craig for being a fool. We want to consider the problems with jumping to conclusions about data. And to give you an example of this, I'm going to share an example where I have jumped to a conclusion about data. What I'm going to do is I am going to share the back end of an old version of Learning Locker, which is our open source learning record store. It's an LRS. For those of you that are working with LRS, with XAPI and LRS, or thinking about it, here's what it could look like. Let me just bring up this particular, draw your attention to the top right-hand corner of the screen. There is a visualization called Popular Content Types by Verb. And what this is doing, this is showing me the amount of views that each type of media got in one of our courses. And the media were blogs, PDFs, videos, webinars, and infographics. I'm now going to make a statement. I'm going to repeat that statement, and we're going to go back into the Adobe Connect room. And I want you to answer what was wrong with the statement that I've made. What's wrong with the assumption that I have jumped to? Here is a very nice, technically data correct visualization. I look at this and I said to myself, this shows me which media types people have found the most useful. It tells me the media types that people have liked the most. Let me rephrase that. This visualization shows me the media types that people have found most useful. It shows me the media types that people have liked the most. What's wrong with that assumption? If you could leave the answer to that, if you can even hear me, in the chat panel that is in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. What's wrong with the assumption that I made when I looked at that visualization? Start at the beginning, Alistair. Always the best place. Or start wherever you feel you've landed. What's wrong with the assumption that I've made about that? Tom Buckham's saying, does liking specifically mean it was useful for them? I don't know, Tom. I didn't think about that at the time I made the assumption. Alistair saying where to start. Francois saying it just shows usage. It might be forced to. No numbers no usefulness at all. Could well be, Francois. Doesn't appear to be a correlation with the number of each item, Thomas is saying. Alice is saying it doesn't show what was actually available. I think by and large what you've all put there is, you've picked apart the assumption that I made, which is exactly what I wanted you to do. I don't believe this workout I'm having done. The problem is that what that visualization shows me is the amount of views that each object had. In the cold light of day, consider this. Maybe the reason that blogs got more views is because there were more pieces of content tagged as blogs. So statistically, if you put more of something in front of people, they're likely to consume more of that thing. The other problem, of course, is that I made the assumption that it was useful to them because it got lots of hits. If I put a one-page, simple PDF in front of you about a concept and you read it, I think there's a good chance that you understand it and you put that one-page PDF to one side. If I put a 40-page PDF in front of you with the same concept but more convoluted, I think you're probably going to go back to that 40-page PDF more often to try and understand it. So in actual fact, the big problem with my assumption is I'm assuming that more hits equals better content, more useful content. In actual fact, it could be absolutely the opposite. Absolutely the opposite. People could be hitting it multiple times because it's a bloody awful piece of content. It doesn't explain itself. They need to keep looking at it again and again. I don't want to labour this point. I think you understand the point I'm making, is pull apart your assumptions around things. Get people to sanity check what you're seeing and understanding as what they see and understand. Ask them to be critical about what you're putting in or proposing to put in front of other people. Thank you, Tom, as well. It is doing my head in at this end, but I'm pleased it's not too distracting for you. It's like a comedy show. It's like a comedy show. My apologies.
Yeah, it's for my dogs. Today it's your construction. So should I hop in here, Craig, a little bit?
Let me take on to the next screen. And let me change the screen out once more. I want you to have a think about
could we jump back to the last slide for just a moment?
Over to you.
Thank you. Yes, thanks, Craig. Yeah, because this is a huge thing, and and the thing is, that's funny about what Craig did is the number of times that we would have management or higher level people from a client ask for exactly that sort of thing. If we want to know what's most popular, it's a very common ask, and yet not meaningful. Back when I was as a scientist and not a data scientist, we used to have a saying in the lab, which was first draw the curves, then plot the data. Meaning we kind of know the answer we want and we're hoping we're going to get there. And it was that acknowledgement of the existence of confirmation bias when you do research. If you have a single hypothesis of, did X help with Y, you start to look for confirmatory evidence. You start to look for things that validate that hypothesis, and you may ignore or just forget to look down other channels of evidence. And so this is bad for research, bad for analysis. It's also, honestly, rather uninteresting because it may not lead to any actionable insights. So what we did when I was in the lab was we would always have multiple working hypotheses. And this is also what I try to do with data. Instead of saying have a single hypothesis or a single question I'm trying to answer, to say what are some different hypotheses. And by working multiple hypotheses, you're going to be more open to looking at a broader body of evidence. And that's going to give you better insight and keep you from falling into these traps that even when we're seasoned working with data, it's very easy to fall down that path and ignore the obvious when we're in the thick of things. We did some things with nudge emails, saying if we send emails to people in the midst of a course, does that increase their participation? We had to be careful looking at the data because there was the issue of there's a natural seasonality to the participation. In some courses, it's everybody signs on a Monday. In other courses, there's new content released every Wednesday, so everybody's frantically on their Tuesday night finishing the last week's content. And so, we had to look at that in context, but we also had to ask several questions. You could do the same thing with, most viewed. Is that, yay, this is awesome? Or, yeah, like you guys said, is it forced? Sometimes with most popular, it's a matter of navigation patterns. I start typing in, if it's a web-based course, I start typing in and my nav bar auto completes and I go back to the last screen I was at. So we've seen navigation patterns where people always jump in on the same screen, not because they want to access that screen, but because that's the quickest way to get into the course.
Which, of course, can lead to massive assumptions if you don't take that into account. You suddenly think that that's the most popular piece of content. It's just the gateway into the course.
Yeah. And Alistair, the statisticians looking to pull apart your analysis, which is good because they will question you. And I think healthcare is such a fabulous field. I look at sometimes at how healthcare does studies because I think it's actually a good analogy to learning studies. Because in both cases, you never have the patient or the learning case, the user, functioning in a vacuum. Just as for the patient, it's not just the treatment. There's so many other things that affect that outcome. It's the same thing with somebody taking a course. There are so many things that are going to affect their course performance and their on-the-job performance. And so learning how do you balance for all those external impacts? How do you do valid studies?
I can see that Francois is likening the next slide to a near-death experience. It's not meant to show that, Francis, but believe me, this afternoon I know exactly how that might feel. What this slide is supposed to convey is going down the rabbit hole, that Alice in Wonderland analogy. And I want to, in the last few minutes, just talk and think about why initial reviews of data, you're looking for an answer to something, you take the data, you get the answer to the question, why that very often, in my experience, and I'm sure Janet's, usually leads to even more questions than answers. So I'd like to try and get this from you, if I may. I'm going to change the screen out one final time. I'm going to shuffle things around. And I want to ask you, where is the search for data taken you? Where have you started off down a path that you thought was going to be a very, very easy discovery path, a very easy piece of research, and then several hours, days, weeks, months, maybe years later, you've come up at the other end thinking, where on earth did the time go? A bit like going onto Wikipedia. So share with us some examples, if you will. If you can't share because of the sensitivity, just be general in your response. I appreciate that the area you work in, you may not be able to go into infinite detail. Alice just sent, there's no text box to type into on the new column, Craig. Oh, Francois, if we're talking about the one that says, where is the search data for data taken you? I can see that Francois has dropped an answer in there, Alistair. I'm guessing you're not seeing the same thing as Francois is. In that case, Alistair, okay, yeah, I'm not sure you can refresh in this window, but if you can, great. Unbelievable. If not, then just drop your answer into the normal chat panel, which clearly is working at the moment because you've just dropped that. You've just dropped that question into there.
And while people are, let's see what people are putting in here. Oh yeah, I love this. Yes, a score of X means mastery, and the attempts to get to that score. There's a score. Tom, there's a colleague of mine who in some of the early work that he was doing with XAPI, they were certifying people on software and just saying, well, is a certain percentage grade on a quiz really good to certify people on this rather complex modeling software? And what they did was they actually used XAPI statements that they could look at the actual clicks and interactions with the software of a novice versus an expert. And so from there was two things. One is that instead of asking questions about the software, you're seeing how do they navigate compared to an expert. And secondly, by seeing where people were struggling after the course of the new users compared to experts, gave them some cues to refine the course design, because they could start saying, okay, here are the things that people are getting, here are the things that they're not. But yeah, it was definitely test scores weren't going to be the answer. Oh, yeah, the completion rates, Francois. I think that's, so many times organizations are obsessed with completions, and it's that qualitative that really matters. And so my brain's jumping to examples. An example of an organization that was doing some compliance training, and they had most of the students scoring poorly on one of the multiple choice questions. It was an ethics course. And they went back and started talking to people to figure out why so many people got that wrong. And what they found out was not that people didn't know the answer. The people they talked to said, no, we know the right answer, but we don't think that goes far enough. We want to hold ourselves to a higher standard than any of the points on the quiz.
Alistair's made an interesting point here. He's saying my search for data has largely been a tragedy. People just not accessing the content we produced. Now, in some ways, Alistair, and it's not what you'd want to hear, but therefore, has the search for data been a tragedy? If your data has shown you that people are not accessing the content you produced, I think the data's done its job. It clearly indicates that for some reason, again, it often leads you to the search for more questions than answers, but for some reason people aren't accessing it. We don't know what that reason is yet, but we know that they're not because your data suggested they're not. So I wouldn't look upon it as being a failure. I'd actually look at it and say, my quest for data was, are people accessing our content? You've done your data, you've done your research. The data says no. It's not what you want to hear. It's disappointing. It's upsetting, but it's done its job. Your research has been good. Now you need to do some more, I think, to figure out why they're not accessing the data. So, guys, I'm once again going to shuffle the screen around one last time, probably one last time. Let me take you.
Sorry. I was looking, Tom was talking about that request for, the simple traffic light system, and I think, that comes up all the time, and that's a hard one on so many levels, but I'm looking at the clock. I guess we don't have time to go down that path. I wish we did, because I think that's a really important topic.
Well, I'm mindful that we are due to finish now. We're due to finish 60 seconds ago. There's this one last screen which won't take long. I'm happy to stay around for another 15 minutes to go into the detail of anything or for you to ask us questions that we may not have answered naturally. So I'm happy to hang around 15 minutes. I think Janet is as well. Clearly, though, guys, you guys have got, you've got busy afternoons or mornings still to cover off. So if you want to hang around, feel free. If not, we fully understand. What I'd love to hear from you before you go, though, is what's been your key takeaway or takeaways from this session? If you click on the T symbol that's on the far left-hand side of your screen on that vertical menu bar, if you just click on that and then click on the whiteboard itself, you'll be able to start typing. It'd be great to hear what your key takeaways are. Once you've typed them, click off the whiteboard and they will, as if by magic, appear. I'm just going to give you an example like this now, like this. There we go. I've just dropped an example on there for you now, which I will now move out of the way to allow you to type. So what's been your key takeaways? What is it that Janet or I, or even better, somebody else said in this webinar that's made you think, I'd never thought of that, or that's a good point, or I need to take a look at that? Some ideas about additional sources of data that can be analysed. Good. good. I'm glad that, somebody somewhere has said something or shown something that's made you think about looking somewhere else other than your usual haunts for some data. That's good to hear. I'd be keen to know what other people have taken away from today as well. Oh, they're stacking up now. Data analysis needs to be part and parcel of what we do. I'm sure Janet's grinning from ear to ear. I can positively hear her from here, and she's based across in the States. Tracking statements like completion or viewed is easy enough to track, yeah, but we need to think about what they actually mean. Great, thank you for picking up on that point, whoever that was that Janet made very eloquently earlier on in the session. And there's one towards the top. I'm just going to drag it down so I can see it better. It says, a confirmation that we need to design our data search the same way we design learning, and it's not via a typical LMS. Don't rely on Craig. Don't rely on Craig to analyse your data. If ever there was a parting takeaway from a session around data, it's pretty much got to be don't rely on Craig to analyse your data. And that was from Alistair. Thank you very much, Alistair. Always a pleasure, never a chore. So I'm going to leave that on the screen for, I don't know, a few more seconds. I'm just going to make it slightly smaller though. And on the bottom of the screen, I'm going to drag in a few things that I think you might find interesting. The box in the bottom left-hand corner, that'll just take you away on a magical mystery tour of some additional resources and links that you might want to have a look at around data, learning analytics, designing for learning outcomes, things like that. And the box in the bottom right-hand corner, there's some files, the HT2 files. One is an overview of what we do, and the other one is the Learning Technology Manager's Guide to XAPI. Even if you are not thinking about using XAPI or a learning record store, that's cool. Download it and have a read though, because it will get you thinking about data and research anyway, even if you're not thinking specifically about that particular piece of software, XAPI, have a look at it anyway. It'll get you thinking on the right lines. Francois has gone, but Francois, if you're watching the recording back, thank you for joining us this afternoon. I can see that another one's been added on there. Don't rely on quantitative data. What do customers actually want? Too often the last or later thing considered. I can see Thomas is typing there. Alistair, Thomas, Tom, we've got about 10 minutes left before I know that one of you has to go and that Janet and I need to go. If you've got questions now, and my sincere apologies for running over, this is normally an hour session. We were asked to try and do it in 45 minutes today. That clearly didn't work, so we're going back to an hour. We did the research. The research tells us this. We're going to change in the future. We're going to go back to an hour. Alistair and Tom, if you've got questions, that's what the chat panel's for. Feel free to pick Janet's brains for the next 10 minutes or so. I'm sure if you've got the time, it would be a worthwhile use of your time to throw some ideas around with her. If you don't want to, that's cool as well. If you want to exit, click in the top left-hand corner of the screen. You'll have an option with the meeting button to exit the room, and you'll be on your merry way back to your working day. But not without a big thank you from Janet and I for joining us today, and a big thank you from me to Janet as well for helping me put this together and continually helping me to facilitate them. So thank you, Janet, and thank you to everybody else that's joined in this afternoon. If you need to disappear, you know what to do. If you want to ask a question, you know what to do. That's all right, Alistair. These things happen. Although I must admit, I'm rather it was you that was late than I was late. So I'm pleased. I'm pleased that it was that way round. No worries at all, Alistair. I'm glad it's given. Like I said, like you've said, I'm glad it's given you something to think about. You know where we are if you want to throw those ideas around, in a little bit more detail. Other than that, we will have the recording up on YouTube within the next few days, week at the most, I would imagine. So do feel free to check out HT2 Labs on YouTube, and you'll see a playlist on there, and I'm sure this will be one of them. Thanks, Alistair. So, Janet, if you want to pull apart Tom's question here while I quickly grab a drink, my throat's about to go. If you want to pull that apart with him, Tom, I'm not sure if you've got your microphone enabled. If you have, it might be good to have a two-way conversation with Janet. It may be more fluid than typing backwards and forwards. So, if you've got a mic opened up, over to you.
Yeah, all
Yeah.
opened it up.
Hi,
Hi
Tom.
there. Yeah, so I keep coming back to this traffic light sort of scenario only because I recall doing a presentation about this a year ago to the business because it was quite a useful vehicle to take something quite simple and then start reverse engineering it to show actually underneath it is much more sort of complexities than you would imagine from like a simple sort of aspirational sort of data view. A year later, and we haven't really moved on too much in terms of having the sort of penny drop moments, and some of that sort of obviously internal business related. But we're still, from our team as such, we're still coming back to the sort of the ideas of ambiguity and sort of flaws in your competency definitions and how we can avoid those, and whether or not a completely flawless definition is utopian or whether there's things you can do to minimize it or so on. So that's probably where
Yeah.
we are at the moment. So any thoughts or ideas of clarity, much appreciated.
I mean, there are a lot of layers to that. One thing that might be interesting to you, I haven't read this in a while, but a few years ago, Purdue University in the United States created something for the students called course signals. And it was basically kind of the same kind of thing. It was red, yellow, green, so that they could detect students who were in danger of failing ahead of time, in sufficient time to intervene. Um, and it was a bit touted initially, but then there's some more recent articles that kind of pick apart where the problems were and where it was not optimal, and so that might be interesting to you, um, perhaps even more so than the original course signals because that's kind of old news. But they're saying, okay, why wasn't it optimal? And so I think there's some articles out on that, and I'm sorry I don't have any references to hand, but that might be interesting. But I think the really important things that you're looking at are, yes, start with the competency definition. And I'm not sure how you've built your competency definition, but I think it's, going and saying, what are the performance things that tell you that you're successful? And then you have to say, is there a correlation between the measures that you have in course or whatever measures you're using with actual performance competency? I mean, that the first place I check and see if there's correlation and not spurious correlation, but actually meaningful correlation between those would be a place to look. I think you're right that the key thing is to build that model. And then the tricky thing is saying, we can maybe get our hands dirty and talk to people in both a quantitative and qualitative way, say, here's the model. But then the next step is, can we access the data that we need to have based on that model? And I think that's there when it comes to that. It sometimes has to push. How are we designing our courses? How are we designing our measures? Are we designing those to generate the data we need? And I think those are, from what you've written, those are all the problems that you're wrestling with. But I almost wonder if it's taking it out of the course scene and going and saying, what are the performance measures on the job? And then saying, can we correlate those back to course performance?
I think in our case, because it's about language learning with students, so
Okay.
there's either a slight gap or a lag in our data. One of the key things you said there, which is tricky for us, is actual performance competency in the real world. So, for example, a measure of success might be students who are confident and on their holidays or something can speak English and use their language skills. That's the bit that we're sort of in the dark about a little bit. So we could easily,
Yeah.
we're a bit mindful of of promising too much, but, how much should we try and promise with this? And state, oh, you're ready, your English is great and ready, sort of off you go. But then we're missing that sort of final piece of real data, if that makes sense. So that makes us a bit cautious in terms of what we should state in the platform or the learning platform, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And language learning is a very complicated one, especially because reading fluency comes before auditory fluency, and auditory fluency comes before verbal fluency. And so, yes, one could do quite well on course metrics, but like you say, once you're out into the wild, you're actually working with a different level of skill. So that's almost one of, does it need to be looked at within the context of the course design, and maybe some of the formative assessments done within the course that could provide that more meaningful data that's likely to correlate with real world performance. Since you might not get the real world measure, are there ways within the formative assessment that you could look at that? And I know that's complicated because then you're asking course designers to change things and teachers to change things, and that's always wildly unpopular.
No, that's useful though. I mean, those are the things we need to think about. It's what we've often come to the conclusion is that we need to spend more time with our sort of colleagues, sort of looking at what data the content we have is going to generate, rather than assuming it will just generate what we need it to generate. If that makes sense.
Yeah,
so
no, you need to design. I'm sorry.
Sorry, go on.
So you need to, you need to design for the data.
That's why I used.
And the thing is that the time lag is killing us here. I'm sorry. I'll be quiet and let you speak.
No, I think we're synchronized in our pausing to allow the other person to speak, which was funny. I was just saying that's why I was using the reverse engineer phrase quite a lot, because more often people have an idea of an endpoint they want to get to, but they haven't actually tracked back into what they need to do to get to that point. And it's that sort of tracking back and starting at the sort of what data will our content generate, and what do we need to change in it to generate the data we need to do this endpoint. That's sort of where we're at the moment, basically.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that what I've found can be very, very helpful at the point you're at is if you can get some of the key players all around a table at the same time. So get instructors or course designers there, get IT people from the data sources there. If you can get a bunch of people around the same table and map out the activity providers and the key activities and the use cases and those sorts of things, and then start saying, so if these are our goals and here's what we have available, how do we bridge that gap? And sometimes if you have all the key players in the room and they can see the big picture together, sometimes it's difficult, but often people will get quite excited and enthusiastic, and it's a lot easier to get buy-in when everybody's in there grasping the same picture and saying, oh, okay, I see where this adds value.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's a good idea.
Trick is getting them all into the room at the same time.
Absolutely. No, I'm thinking of that already. Especially at the moment, actually, with the holiday season upon us, it's arranging meetings is sort of an art in itself at this point in time. Thank you very much. So lots of considerations there. Thank you both for that. Much appreciated.
Well, you're very welcome. Hopefully it's been a little helpful, and thanks for joining us.
Yes, once again, Tom, thank you for joining us. Thank you for hanging around at the end and taking the time, and for Janet to have that conversation. This recording will be up on YouTube within a week at the very most. I'll give people a nudge when it's up there anyway if you attended. But there's an archive, there's a recording of this for you to take, to go back and have a look at that. Hopefully you find useful for some reflection. But once again, many thanks, Tom, and thank you as always, Janet. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Chris.